If you want to be a better writer, there are three things you need to do: understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first two steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for middle grade and young adult stories, spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched Being the Ricardos so that we can study genre. This 2021 film is categorized under many different genres, including drama, drama biopic, drama romance, comedy, and comedy drama. It was written and directed by Aaron Sorkin. Alrighty, Melanie. So we know what the marketers think of this film, but how did you classify it?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'm not really sure. So I'm going to walk through some of the thinking that I did today. But I wanted to see this movie to watch Javier Bardem and also Nicole Kidman act as two very famous people. And when I chose this movie, I didn't realize that Aaron Sorkin was the writer-director. And I do have to say, though, that I used to believe that I analysed movies well, but now I believe, as we're doing this podcast, what I used to do was so light touch compared to what we're doing now. And I've started to think that I'm ruining movies for myself.
Yes, okay, it is a job hazard, I will admit that. But the upside to all this deep study, obviously we're learning more about the craft of storytelling. But for me anyway, what it means is that when we come across someone who really knows how to tell a story, it gets super exciting. I get really jazzed, and then I become a fan of that writer, for life.
Yes, and it is good. I agree. And it is nice when we're finding things out. Or there's a particular component of a story that's really well done. And I find that just as exciting too. So even sometimes when other things may not work. If there's one element that's done really well, I put that in my little sort of like toolkit of examples to use so that when I've got clients who are coming across that problem, I've got something there to be able to say, well, look at this movie as an example in particular of this particular skill set or the way they do it as a really good example and a teaching tool. So I'm with you. That part is exciting. So where to start with Being the Ricardos and its genre? So I'm going to read out some words that Aaron Sorkin has used from his masterclass on writing. Now, I've taken these words from the Writing Cooperative website. So I'm letting you know what these words are, what he says, so that you know what I'm trying to channel, and I'm going to channel Sorkin during my analysis. So, quote, "When you're a writer, especially when you're starting out, but I think it's a good rule for the life of your career, you need to be a diagnostician. When you see something and it doesn't work, instead of being snarky about it, and instead of just joking with your friends about how bad this thing was that you just saw, figure out why it's bad. Your goal should be to diagnose why it didn't work." So this movie and the story it told didn't work for me. So I kept asking myself why. And here's another quote about the movie, Aaron Sorkin's movie called Malice. And I did get it from a website. I just didn't write it down and I can't remember. I couldn't find it after I'd written it down. So, but it is there on a website just in case you're wondering where I got it from. And the quote is, "It's just that the movie is confused about what exactly it is, what story it's telling, who its characters are, and what it wants to say." And this is how I see Being the Ricardos. So let's start with genre. So what type of movie is this? So today I'm going to work through the 5 leaves of Story Grid's genre clover because I thought this would be a good way for me to start dissecting and finding out what in particular I couldn't work out, or why I thought it wasn't working for me. So each clover looks at a particular type of aspect of genre. So I'll start with the time leaf. So this refers to the format of the medium used to tell the story. So I went with a long format for the time, which is, it's a movie, so it's a longer form of storytelling. In the reality leaf, I went with factualism because it's a story that refers to the facts of history or a biography. So that made sense to me. The style leaf, well, is this movie a biopic? Well, not really, because Sorkin himself says it's not a biopic. So this story is centered around 1 week in the production of I Love Lucy. So is it a mockumentary? Well, it starts off this way, but surely it would include more interviews and a more reporter-like narrative. So no, I don't think it's a mockumentary. So I've gone back to a very higher level and I've tagged it as a comedy drama. So from the structure leaf, now this is where it starts getting a little bit interesting for me. So it doesn't have the classic form of an arch plot narrative. It's not an anti-plot, even though Sorkin does use poetic devices associated with anti-plot stories. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. There is a chapter in the book, Narrative Form by Susan Keene, which is called Order and Disorder. And Keene's chapter helped me confirm that this movie is not structured as an anti-plot. So if it's not either arch plot or anti-plot, then I've just gone with it's a mini plot story. Now that might be a very easy way out, but that's what I'm going with at the moment. So from the content leaf, here is where this is one of the areas where the story starts to fall apart from me. Is it about 1 week in the lives of Lucy and Desi? Yes and no. It includes scenes ranging over 14 years before the week in 1952, and it ends with a reference to Lucy and Desi's divorce in 1960. The 1 week while filming the episode Fred and Ethel Fight does provide an anchor for the story, but the flash forwards and flashbacks dilute the tension by diverting our attention away from the stakes at risk. The flashes take up valuable time and are like vignettes instead of driving the points of tension home. Is it a society story about women's conflict, pregnancy, the hunt for communists, or masculinity in the 1950s? Well, maybe. There are definitely speeches in the movie that touch on those topics, and there are some key scenes that deal with this subject matter, but I can't say that this is the one thing the story is about. Is it about cancel culture or censorship? Well, it could be if we think about communism, Lucy's pregnancy, Desi's Cuban heritage. And again, there are key scenes and speeches with the executives who sponsor the show that could support this argument. And the big reveal with J. Edgar Hoover at the end of the movie that removes the spectre of Lucy as a red also supports an argument that it could be about those things. I don't think that it's singularly about any of those things, though. Is it a marriage story? Well, it could be. Desi's fidelity bookends the story, and Lucy repeats her plea to save her marriage throughout the movie, and it appears to be one of her two personal drivers. Lucy's decision to check the communist box on her voting registration, and that's a thing that I don't have to do over here in Australia, so that is a bit of an education point for me. I didn't realise that that's something that needed to be done. So checking that box was the result, I think, of a loyalty to her grandfather and to keep him happy, because he helped raise her after her father died. And I think sometimes that this is a bit of a clue, because it's a representation of the connection that Lucy wants with a home. And a home is what Lucy wants above all else. Is her home a home? I don't think it is, because Desi is not there. Is the I Love Lucy set her home? Well, fictionally, it is for the Ricardos, and literally, I think it is too, because Desi is there. Desi's philandering puts the set home and the fictional home created for I Love Lucy in jeopardy. The power of the gossip magazines of the time was quite astounding and has parallels with the powers of modern day social media to raise or destroy someone's star power. Why would Lucille stay with someone who undermines her personal credibility as a juicy tidbit? How could the show continue if Desi and Lucy divorced in real life when the illusion the TV series created was so real to the audience? This is why Honey, I'm Home, I think, triggers her pause at the end of the movie. Is this about Lucy's internal journey that will lead her to filing for divorce from Desi? I'm not sure. Is this movie saying Lucille will never have a home because her ambition and pursuits of a career get in the way? Well, in the 1950s, that's a possibility, but Sorkin isn't hamstrung by facts in the movie. Well, that's my opinion. Sorkin also has a reputation for portraying strong women, but with messy personal lives and a certain amount of craziness. So it would make sense to me that the content genre is not clear in this movie if the story structure is a mini plot, because mini plot stories are more about internal journeys. And Lucy does have an internal revelation by the end of the film. However, I'm going to pause there because, Valerie, I'd really love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, my thoughts. I've never been shy with my thoughts. Okay. I want to pick up on a few of the things you've said there. Aaron Sorkin, when I did a little research in preparation for today's episode, Aaron Sorkin said in one of the interviews that everything that happened in the movie happened in real life, but he compressed the timeline. So in real life, Lucille Ball was worried about Desi's fidelity. They did argue with the executives about how Lucille's pregnancy would be portrayed on the show. And Lucille Ball was accused of being a communist. And I'm sort of saying Lucille Ball as opposed to Lucy because it can get a little confusing if we're talking about the real person or the character she portrayed. But maybe I'll just say Lucy from now on. So it doesn't get too confusing. So in the film, all of those things happened in 1 week. In real life, it took a number of years for those things to happen. So for anyone who is writing historical fiction, this is a really important takeaway because when we're writing historical fiction, we can get, well, we do a lot of research, first of all, and we get sort of tied to that research and enslaved by that research. And we want our novel to be as historically accurate as possible. So we can put activities in the years that they actually happened. So although it's historically accurate, it's not dramatically very interesting. So the key takeaway here from Being the Ricardos to me is you can monkey around with the timeline being if it means making your story more interesting for viewers or readers, because it is historical fiction, right? And this goes back to what Melanie was saying a little earlier. When talking about the genre, Being the Ricardos is not a documentary. At no point does it claim to be a documentary or even a mockumentary. Although they do have those documentary style interviews with the two writers and the executive producer, who's also a writer. They interview those people as older people here and now. And then, of course, we see them actually working on the job back in the 50s. All right. Because all of those things happened in real life, it means that Desi did, in fact, diffuse the communism issue with a call from J. Edgar Hoover. And I'm going by what Aaron Sorkin said in an interview. I didn't do research beyond it. I took his word for it because he's done a lot more research on this than I did. In one of the interviews, the journalist actually did a follow-up question and said, "Even the call from Hoover?" And Sorkin said, "Even the call from Hoover, it happened just like that in real life." He didn't use poetic license or creative license in that at all. He said that that's how it happened in real life, and it was so good, he just recreated it in the film. Now, in saying that, I have to be honest. If I had not heard Aaron Sorkin say that, and if I didn't know that Aaron Sorkin, who is a very accomplished writer, if I didn't know that he is the one who'd written it, I would have been crying foul on that call so badly because it's a deus ex machina, in my opinion. So what's a deus ex machina? Well, it's a term that comes from Greek theater, and it refers to the habit that the Greeks had, of having a god, one of their gods, descend into a story at the very last minute and solve all the problems for all the characters. And it is a big no-no in storytelling. But that said, it's a fairly common rookie mistake. But Aaron Sorkin is no rookie, right? So that's why I'm sort of giving it a pass here. One, he's no rookie, so he's not the type of writer who would put a deus ex machina at the end of his story. He's a very experienced writer. He has done a lot of research, and he says this is the way history unfolded, so he's sort of squeaking by there. But for any audience member who doesn't know the history of the show, it's kinda like if it quacks like a duck, and if it walks like a duck, it must be a duck. Well, if it quacks like a deus ex machina and it walks like a deus ex machina, it's a deus ex machina. So, the genre, yes. In looking at the genre of Being the Ricardos, I think we have to go back and look at story form. Yes, we're back to talking about story form. And I admit I've still got a lot of studying to do when it comes to genre and story form. My eyes were first opened to this in the episode we did about Three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. So I am still at the beginning of my research into this. My go-to resource is Story by Robert McKee, although there's only one chapter on story form there, and he also calls it event design. So if you have a recommendation for another resource that I could go to learn more about story form, I would love to know what it is. Now, because of the multiple storylines happening in this film, I'm classifying, according to Robert McKee's story form layout, I'm classifying Being the Ricardos as a multi plot story, which, again, according to McKee, is less than the classical form of an arc plot story, but more than the minimal plot of a mini plot story. It's clear as mud. So there are certainly elements of the arc plot form in each of the storylines, but none of them is fully realized. Now, specifically, I would say that this is a quote unquote soft mini plot story. That's McKee's term. And by that, he means, and this comes from page 56 of Story, he means, quote, leaning toward mini plot as plot lines slow their pace and action becomes internalized. For example, the whole marriage story is happening inside Lucille's mind, right? Melanie?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Actually, I had not thought about that as a multi-plot, I suppose. So that's a really an interesting area that we probably need to look at a little bit more. And there are probably a lot more movies than we're aware of that use that device or that plot structure. So it'd be really good to find a couple of those and study them a bit more deeply. So last week, while analysing Turning Red, I focused on looking at the constraints that a premise or a genre provides a writer. And dialogue is also an aspect of writing that is impacted by the choices about the type of story a writer tries to tell. I personally find some of Sorkin's dialogue confusing and elusive, and the use of non sequiturs reminds me of absurdist and postmodernist plays, such as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead by Tom Stoppard and Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. So, techniques such as non sequiturs in Being the Ricardos are also used in modernist literature. So, what is a non sequitur? Well, it's a conversational literary device often used for comedic purposes. It is something said that, because of its apparent lack of meaning, relative to what preceded it seems absurd to the point of being humorous or confusing. So, translated literally, non sequitur means it does not follow. So, postmodernist literature focuses on the deconstruction of traditional literary forms, and that is why non sequiturs are used quite a lot in that particular style of writing. So, I went back to my university textbook, Literary Theory and Introduction by Terry Eagleton. And this book is so old and the glue is so brittle that the pages fell out when I started to open it. And I think this was an omen that I was probably on the wrong track. Um, but Literary Theory, the book, has a whole chapter on postmodernism. And this is an era when writers like Beckett, Brecht, and Nabokov were starting to question structure and use very different techniques in their writing as a method of questioning the conventional thinking of the time. So to read through this again was a very, very heavy trudge. And I don't think it really answered my question other than to kind of remind me of what postmodernist literature was, but also to confirm for me that Sorkin was just using this technique. He wasn't actually trying to write in this particular style. There is also a chapter in the book Narrative Form by Susan Keene called Order and Disorder. Keene's chapter helped me confirm that this movie is not structured as an anti-plot story. While being the Ricardos has a disordered chronology, the flashbacks and the flash forwards do relate to something mentioned in the main story, which is part of that week of filming the episode. Or it refers, those flashbacks and flash forwards refer to something that the writers in the interviews that frame the story also say. Again, I don't believe that Sorkin was attempting to write an absurdist or a postmodernist story by using these devices, but the use of non sequiturs tries to show some different trains of thought and put in deliberate misunderstanding amongst the characters. So I think he's using that kind of device to put confusion in there, and also in the mind of the viewers. According to an article from the Script Lab, Sorkin's use of a non-linear plot is meant to enhance the precision of the dialogue in each scene, and it's the dialogue that gives scenes the structure. And I'm not really sure if that's right or if that even makes sense. So that's something that I would need to go and look into a great deal more before I could say, yes, I think that's a good statement or that's not a good statement. But the rapid-fire staccato rhythm of the lines is like being disorientated by machine gun fire for me. To me, this is not banter, it's just noise. The bickering nature of the dialogue and its delivery I also find very grating. Now, it really bothers me that I cannot relate to or enjoy this type of writing when so many other people seem to. So here is the kernel of a thought I had about this. So if I don't find Sorkin's style of writing witty or humorous, then what do I find funny and witty? Well, this led me to two examples. And the first one is the 1997 movie The Castle, written by Santo Chilaro, Tom Gleisner, Jane Kennedy, and Rob Stitch, which is an Australian movie written by a group of comedians who are also well known for their comedy skit show called The D Generation. The second is the current TV series called Derry Girls, which is classified as a teen sitcom black humour series written by Lisa McGee, and it's about a group of Catholic schoolgirls growing up in Londonderry in Northern Ireland in the 1980s. And there is a lot about these girls that I can relate to. So what is it about these two examples that are different from being the Ricardos? Well, I think it comes down to cultural relevance and tone. And I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but it's interesting to note as writers that something you write will not land the same way in a different culture, even if you speak the same language. So, does being Australian make being the Ricardos less impactful? Well, possibly, because the context, so the time, symbols, themes, style of humour in I Love Lucy, and the care factor I have for the relationship between Desi and Lucille has less meaning for me. So there is an absence of universality in being the Ricardos for me personally. So Australians would not have been exposed to I Love Lucy. Television did not broadcast in Australia until 1956, and I Love Lucy finished up in 1957. So my parents didn't grow up with this show, and it was not part of our family routine. Another question I asked while watching this movie was, when the lines are always so cutting and razor sharp, does it water down the impact? And I think the answer to that is yes. So a well-timed punch can be far more effective than multiple rapid slaps landing continuously. So as a poet, the rhythm of words really interests me. When I mention the staccato bickering delivery in certain parts of Being the Ricardo, it's achieved by writing with short sentences, short words that have hard sounds and a lot of stresses. As a writer, understanding how rhythm and meter works can add to your prose. But on the flip side, the overuse of poetic devices reduces the impact of the message, hence the difference between the punch and the continuous slaps. Out of interest, I went back to Dialogue by Robert McKee. And McKee uses many, many references in his 2016 book. And interestingly, Sorkin isn't included. So I could be reading too much into this, and that's true because, I could fill in the gaps that really are not there. But I did think that was very interesting. So here is my lingering question from this week's study of Being the Ricardos. So if the movie doesn't really know what it is, then how can the dialogue work? And this brings me back to one of the points Valerie and I have been exploring this season. And it's the point Suzanne Keane makes in the book Narrative Form. And I quote, "Genre frames reading experience and sets expectations. Then readers judge whether the story meets the expectations when compared against their experience and familiarity with the type of stories they have read before. So even if the story is a mini plot or a multi-plot, then the story should be told in a way that makes sense for that type of story structure."
Interesting. Interesting. I am a fan of Aaron Sorkin's dialogue. I just am. It is fast. I admit it is fast. And there were times, there's even a scene where Desi says to Lucy, "I hate it when you change topics so quickly." And she says something like, "It's not hard to keep up." And I thought to myself at that point, yeah, it kind of is. So it is kind of hard to keep up with you sometimes, but I still like it. And here's my working theory on dialogue. I think because this is a question that novelists have all the time. How do you write good dialogue? And McKee's book Dialogue is a good reference, although it's, set aside 6 months to really dive into it and learn it. I think one of the reasons Aaron Sorkin is so good at dialogue and he's so lauded for being the dialogue king is because he comes from theater. He was a playwright. That's what he studied in. Mindy Kaling, same idea, wrote for the stage. And if you've ever read the script for a stage play, it's nothing but dialogue. That's all you have is dialogue. So you better be really good at it or the play is going to fall apart quickly. So I have a number of plays that I have begun studying for the dialogue because I'm always looking to improve my own writing skills. I'm a big fan of Oscar Wilde. So that's an area. If dialogue is something that you want to improve in your own writing, read scripts of plays because that's all you have. And you can even take that as an exercise and write a scene or maybe even the first act of your novel. Write it as though it were presented on the stage and see how the dialogue you've written, does it stand up? Does it not stand up? Anyway, it's a fun exercise. These are the ways I get my jollies by doing these things. Okay, back to genre. This is only the second time that I have specifically looked at genre in a non-arc plot story. So I'm going to be really honest. I am not an expert here. I am only at the phase of of compiling a bunch of questions. I don't have the answers yet. I'm just still discovering the questions. And what I am trying to figure out, what I'm trying to discover is this. Does my current understanding of genre, which primarily comes from StoryGrid, because it makes a lot of sense to me, the StoryGrid approach to genre, does that apply to stories that are not arc plot? I mean, it applies, but how does it apply? Where are the limits? Where are the boundaries? How does a mini plot performance story look? What does it look like? Which scenes do you leave in? Which do you omit? These are things I just don't know. But I have the questions. That's half the battle. Also, I have to admit that studying this is not a massive priority for me because, in terms of all the topics related to storytelling and story theory that are to be studied, I'm prioritizing the ones that I am using in my own novels. And I am partial to arc plot stories. I like watching them, I like reading them, I like writing them. At some point that may change, but right now arc plot is kind of where my head is and where my heart is. That said, if multi-plot or mini plot or anti-plot stories rock your world and you want to write them, my best recommendation is to find as many examples as you possibly can and just get going with it. Dive in. Make a list of similarities and differences across all the different types of stories and see how they're being presented. And then look at the information that you've gathered and find out what from this can you use in your own writing. What lessons from other writers that have gone before you can you take to use and improve your own novel or screenplay or whatever it is you're writing? So, as I probably have said in previous episodes, when Melanie and I are preparing for these episodes, we do our study independently and then we come together and put it all in a script and here we are. So everything that I had in my notes to say about genre, Melanie has already said. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit now and talk about the way that this film has been presented. So Aaron Sorkin is a master storyteller, right? He has proven that to us time and time again. And now that he's also directing films, we're starting to get a sense of his style of filmmaking. And he makes the type of films that I would call, for lack of a better phrase, artistic films. Now, I know there are art house films and that kind of stuff. And because I'm not a film studies major, I don't know where the delineation lines are for like what is an art house film. And I don't know that. But being the Ricardos, the Trial of the Chicago Seven, Jobs, these are more artistic types of stories. They lean toward mini plot. They're not arc plot. That's what I mean. So we're getting a sense of this is kind of where his head is now at this phase in his career as a writer and filmmaker and director. They're more artistic films, less sort of blockbustery type Hollywood, standard Hollywood films. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, this is a podcast about writing. We're writers, so let me focus in on the writing in Being the Ricardos. It is at an extremely high level. The technique he displays here is really impressive. I'm guessing this is the kind of film that, the average moviegoer is probably lukewarm about. It might puzzle a lot of people. They may not hate it, but my guess is that they're not raving about it either, and they're probably not recommending it to a lot of friends. They may watch it and at the end just sort of turn off their TV because this is on Amazon Prime, turn off their TV and go to bed. Or, without thinking about it any longer than that, and they might just think, "Oh, yeah, well, that was okay," and they go on about their lives. Now, in saying that, I'm also betting that this is exactly the type of show that film students and story nerds like me will totally geek out over because the craft is so mwah, delicious. Let me explain what I'm talking about here. The vast majority of stories, whether it's books, films, TV shows, or plays, most of them have one plot line, their arc plot, and they're linear. Being the Ricardos is none of those things. A single linear arc plot story is challenging. It's challenging to pull off in a way that is interesting and works and people want to read and go to. And if you are currently writing your first novel, I sincerely recommend that you stick with a single linear arc plot story and master it. Get it really working. Make that thing sing before you move on. Now, for some reason that I don't understand, there's an awful lot of novice writers who insist on messing around with the timeline of their story. Maybe they think it's more literary. I don't know. And I have followed up with these authors who I meet in book clubs and writing forums. Sometimes they're clients or they contact me because they want to work with me. And I ask, why all the flashbacks and the flash forwards and like what's happening? And they don't really have a specific answer. They just feel like that's more artistic. It's more literary. It's something that they should be doing. No, no, it isn't. Not until you can get a single plot line, linear arc plot story humming and you can whiz that thing around and stand it on its head and it still rocks and rolls. Just leave it all out. It's your story. You can do what you want, but you'll be doing yourself a huge favor if you just stick to the basics and nail those first. We don't need a lot of flashbacks and flash forwards. We don't need a lot of framing devices or, more plot lines and more characters is not going to make your story more interesting if the basics are not in place first. And I think that's why, I think that's why writers want to do this. They're trying to make the story more compelling. Maybe their story is starting to flounder a little and they know they need to jazz it up. They know that their story is losing momentum. So they think, aha, I have just the solution. I'll add a new character. I'll do a big flashback. I don't know. No, 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 no. Take it from one who has been down that road and already has those bruises and has already run headlong into that brick wall. It's not the answer. Because what we're actually doing when we default to that approach is we're actually making the story less interesting, not more interesting. We're increasing the difficulty of writing the thing, and we're increasing the chances that our story will be abandoned by our audience, whether they're moviegoers or novel readers or whatever. The thing that makes a story interesting is, well, you have to have the fundamentals in place. But what an audience member, whether that's a reader or a viewer, what they're looking for is conflict. Your story must have conflict and tension and escalating stakes. Keep that in mind. I'm going to circle back to that idea in a few minutes. In Being the Ricardos, Aaron Sorkin has somehow managed to weave together the following elements. He's got an A story, which is when the characters are preparing the show during the week. There's a B story. Those are flashbacks to Desi and Lucy falling in love. There's a framing device, which is interviews in the present day with the show's executive producer and writers. There's Lucille's creative mind as she pictures how parts of the show storylines will play out. These are the black and white reproductions of scenes from the actual show, I Love Lucy. It's a story within a story. This must really mess with their heads. I don't know how actors do this, but as an audience member, I find it fascinating. What you have are actors performing a film, portraying actors performing a TV show. Very meta. It's like looking into a series of mirrors. It's very fun for me. And there's also 3 separate mini plot storylines that we talked about earlier. There's You've got performance, you've got marriage, you've got society, with 2 dimensions, right? All Melanie talked about all this off the top of the show. All of that is woven into a tight mini plot story. This, trust me, this is next level stuff. In my own writing practice, I've been working on a novel, it's my 3rd novel, that has the form of a nonlinear story within a story. Now, I did not make those decisions lightly. In fact, I fought them tooth and nail. I really did. But I couldn't find any other way to make the story work. Now, because I've been studying this nonlinear nested story structure for 3 years now, I'm at the point where I know in theory how to make that form work. But even then, executing it is really hard. So hard that in order to keep this story moving, I actually have rethought the nonlinear plot line, and I have reimagined it so that it will work as a linear storyline. So now I have a story within a story, both of them are linear. So I've been doing a lot of rewriting to fix that, just so that I can finish this book and move on with my life. Now, listen, it's easy to stick a framing device at the beginning and end of a story like a couple of bookends. It's easy to dump a bunch of expository backstory into a flashback. It's easy to write a story with multiple plot lines and multiple protagonists. Uh, it's easy if you don't care about whether your book is going to work or not, or whether anyone's going to read the thing. You know, it just is. I'm assuming if you're listening to this podcast that you are interested in the craft of story. So listen carefully to what I'm about to say, because this is a hard-earned lesson that I have had to learn, and I pass it to you joyfully. Every time you make a shift away from a linear arc plot storyline, or you add an element to your story, you increase the degree of writing difficulty. Do yourself a favor and tread really carefully here. With Being the Ricardos, while Aaron Sorkin has absolutely displayed a mind-boggling degree of technical writing skill, it doesn't automatically follow that the story is more interesting. It's certainly more artistic, but not necessarily more interesting. With Being the Ricardos, Aaron Sorkin has really shown us his level of technique, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a story that is more interesting than a straight up single plot line linear arc plot story. In fact, in my opinion, I think he's trying to juggle so many balls here that he let the most important one drop. And this is where I'm circling back to this idea of conflict and tension and escalating stakes being the most important, one of the most important things in the story. And here, to me, there's not a lot of conflict, there's not a lot of tension, and the stakes just don't feel very high. So let's look at the 3 main events that happened during this week, right? We've got Lucy being accused of being a communist. Lucy is worried that Desi is having an affair, and Lucy is pregnant, and they want her character to be pregnant too. Awesome. Okay. The first 2 storylines are set up beautifully in the first 10 minutes of the film. And it seems like the storyline about whether Lucy is a communist or not, it feels like that's going to be the main plot. Her concerns about Desi's fidelity seems like it's going to be the subplot. The problem is that all the activity about Lucy's membership in the Communist Party is happening off screen. On screen, we're seeing Lucy being concerned about the show and making it the best it can be. What started out as a hot button issue has been diluted, and it ends up being an event that's happening in the background behind a performance story, the performance of Lucy's creative genius. For most of the film, Lucy isn't worried about whether the show will be canceled, right? And that's the thing that's at stake. If she's proven to be a communist, they're going to lose the show. And because she's not worried, we're not worried either. Lucy is more concerned with looking stupid and her intelligence being called into question. She hates it when Desi's whole PR tactic is to suggest that she just checked the wrong box. And she says, no, I didn't. I checked exactly the box that I wanted to check and that I meant to check. And there's even a bit with her and Madeline, the only female writer. And Madeline says, I'm in there trying to make Lucy look smarter. And she's saying, are you suggesting that Lucy is not smart? This is a real bone of contention for Lucille Ball in the show. And, another example, her focus is, and she goes back to it over and over and over again, it is illogical that Lucy, the character, would not hear Ricky coming in her front door. And that makes sense. She's right there. Lucy, not the character in the show, but Lucille Ball in the film, she also doesn't seem outwardly concerned about whether Desi is having an affair. Although she knows the photo that's in the tabloids, she knows that was taken 6 months prior at an event that she also attended. She does question him repeatedly. And this is sort of like a low hum running under the rest of the story. And she does catch him in a lie. Spoiler alert. She does catch him in a lie at the end of the film with lipstick on his handkerchief. And there's a title that comes up at the end of the film that says that Lucy does divorce him. However, she divorces him 8 years later, 8 years after those events. So it's hardly a pressing issue for the marriage. Like there's no ticking clock there. There's nothing pressing, nothing urgent that needs to be dealt with. She caught him, and off they went and did 8 more years of the show. Lucy's focus is on making sure the show the best it can be, because as long as she does that, Desi will adore her, and she has a whole monologue about that. Aaron Sorkin's also really good at monologues, by the way. So you'd think that Lucille Ball would be very involved in all the creative decisions. And yes, she is involved in most of them. But the third storyline, remember, is about Lucille Ball's pregnancy and whether it will become part of the arc of the show and her character, Lucy. But even though that's like a third plot line happening here in the story, that point she hands off to Desi. She defers to him and she lets him make all those decisions. Her focus is not on the show writ large. She's focused on the comedy of the show. So all of that to say that even though Aaron Sorkin has demonstrated just exquisite technical writing, even he failed to deliver on a key storytelling principle. And listen, guys, if Aaron Sorkin can't do it, we can't either. We do not have his writing chops and his years and years of experience. We just don't. So if he's going to stay away from that stuff, I'm going to stay away from it too. I'm learning a lesson here. Even Aaron Sorkin, as much clout and as much power as he has in the film industry, he still only gets 2 hours of airtime. And because he's chosen to fill it with multiple storylines, stories within stories, and, all that kind of jazz, he simply doesn't have time to develop any of them to their fullest. And I think that's a shame. I really do. So I'm going to bang this drum again. As writers, the first thing that we need to do is learn how to write a singular, linear plotline story that works. If you don't know how to do that, and you start adding new point of view characters and new plot lines, and you start monkeying with the timeline, then believe me when I say that what's motivating you is either naivete or ignorance or good old-fashioned hubris.
I think I really enjoyed listening to you then and hearing what you had to say. And one of the takeaways I'm going to take with me from listening to what you said is that it's still, and I agree with your last point there, that we do, especially as beginning writers, need to learn those singular plotline stories. But it's all right to make mistakes as well, because if Aaron Sorkin, like you said, can, do that and experiment and still not quite pull it off, then I think that's one thing about being an artist, is that you're allowed to play and make mistakes. And I think that that is important. It's just some of us do it in private and some of us do it very publicly.
Hear, hear.
And that's all good. So it's okay to make mistakes and it's all right to not get things right and to play around. But I think, yes, getting the basics down is absolutely essential. So today's action step is to create a timeline for your story. So if you have a linear story, then make sure that your scenes, times, dates, and locations all make sense and follow on from one another. If you aren't telling a linear story, then do the same. Look at the links, the main narrative. Is there some thing connecting the scenes together, and make sure that they add up to the story that you're really trying to tell.
Well, that wraps it up for another week. Join us again next week when we discuss Knives Out. I am really looking forward to this one. I love that film. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to my Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find out more about Melanie, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit her on Facebook. She's listed under Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory does not have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.